Hi and welcome back. This is Police Stories Podcast. Thanks for joining me. Possibly your first time, or maybe you've returned, in which case thank you. This is episode 50 and it's a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force. Episode 50, I never thought I'd get here. Seems quite surprising to say the least, but there we go. Got a few more to go yet. Hopefully you're enjoying it. Really good downloads again this week and a lot of interest via YouTube, which is handy, and a few nice comments on there, so thanks for that. So just to take you back briefly, so at this point in my career I'm on the Marine Policing Unit based in London and the Metropolitan Police, and working on the Thames, the River Thames, not just the Thames, because the Marine Unit covers all the sort of the waterways in London, of which there are numerous. So obviously you've got the River Thames, as you would expect, and certainly the bulk of your work is there probably, but you have to cover everything. So every pond, river, stream, canal. I mean, there's a really extensive canal sort of waterways throughout London, and there's lots and lots of work there. You can imagine there's quite a few robberies and shootings in certain areas, and invariably the weapons get kind of dumped into those waterways. So there's some searching to be done, and a lot of that is the dive team, and ultimately, as you probably already know, that's where I ended up. So we'll deal with that in a future episode. But quite often you could be tasked on a day to be based in a van, and that van would have the ability to take you on the water, obviously. So you would have loads of kit, dry suits on board, and an inflatable boat and various engines, paddles, etc. And you may well be tasked to go and carry out a search for, lost property, stolen property, a weapon, if it was visible, if it was shallow. Otherwise it would become a dive job. And also sometimes missing persons, that may well end up, unfortunately, as bodies in those waterways, so you could find yourself literally anywhere within London, any of the docks, with your van, and then getting there and blowing up your boat and carrying out search or something like that. That added another element to it, and that was quite interesting. I always enjoyed the sort of van calls, they could lead you to all sorts of places. Another thing that we commonly did on the river itself, if you were based on the boats, the sort of the marks, the uniform boats, because obviously we do have plain boats as well that are unmarked should we need a slightly sneakier role to play in something. But yeah, we'd be boarding vessels regularly. So obviously you can imagine the Thames does attract a lot of leisure vessels. And there's a couple of big marinas up near London, one particularly right by Tower Bridge, that's very, very popular with, private yachts and motorboats and all sorts. So on a busy summer's day, especially a bank holiday weekend, you may get 50 private boats come up and intend to go into that marina. Now, it's always quite a challenge on the river because of the fast tides we've talked about before, and it wasn't unusual for those boats to get in some sort of distress. Now, technically that role was carried out by the lifeboat, but obviously if we were nearby and we heard on the radio that someone had lost their engine, was about to be sort of washed under a bridge or up onto the shore, then clearly we were not going to not get involved and not help. So we found ourselves doing that quite a bit. We would also board those vessels quite often, and very much in a friendly way, not necessarily for a sort of criminal purpose. It would quite often be just to get an idea of who was coming in and out of the river, and there may be some information that perhaps some drugs was coming up, the river on board a vessel or something like that. So you may come alongside that boat and have a chat with them and end up going aboard, and it's not impossible you could be carrying out a search, but quite often you'd more be chatting to the skippers and finding out where they'd come from, where they'd gone, and then invariably there was perhaps a form to be filled out just to say you'd been on board. But what we did a lot of practicing for was what we call pacing, which is basically when your boat comes alongside another boat, and then you want to actually put people from your boat onto it. Now remember, the standard crew is kind of 3 people. So one would stay as the skipper on board the boat, and he would put 2 of his crew off onto the vessel you were intending to board. So we practiced a lot of pacing, which started off initially very slowly with that boat barely moving, and you certainly want to be able to really you want that boat to be moving. You might think, oh, why doesn't the boat just stop? It's a lot easier. But if we came alongside skippers, we'd be saying, just maintain your speed and course. If they were going slow, 5 or 6 knots, maybe 10 knots, that suited us fine. In fact, it made it a lot easier to put people on board. But we did a lot of practicing with the training team coming alongside, and obviously not causing damage to either boat's fairly important, because, you know, you're talking about hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of police boat. And equally, you know, some of those private vessels were worth, you know, double that. They're sort of big and expensive flash ones. So you didn't want to be damaging any vessels. And we very rarely did. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but not on my watch, as they say. So some of the practice we would do would get progressively faster. And we got to the point where we could happily board a vessel at, you know, 40, 45 knots and put people across. I'm not saying it wasn't without risk, but we might need to be able to do that, or we might need to be able to put, for example, firearms officers, specialist firearms officers, as I used to be, onto those vessels to perhaps deal with a person on board. It became a lot more fraught then, but it was something we practiced. We would also board commercial ships. So as we've already talked about, you get quite a few commercial vessels coming up the river on the Thames. So they could be, you know, literally container ships, or quite often they could be sugar ships or something bringing in, you know, some sort of cargo. And we might need to go aboard those. Now, we might choose to do that from the shore. You know, we would park up and climb up the ladders and then actually access the ship by, you know, the shore. Or we might choose to do it in the river. And quite often they would then lower, or they would already have lowered perhaps what are called pilot ladders, which are fairly ropey looking, excuse the pun, sort of rope stroke wooden ladders that are lowered down the side of a vessel. Now, bearing in mind, some of these big commercial vessels can be 10, 12, maybe even 15 metres above the water. So these are really big vessels. You know, they could be 200, 300 metres long in some cases, with, you know, sort of 30 to 50 metre beams. You know, that's how wide they were. Huge, huge vessels. But if they lowered a pilot ladder down the side for you, invariably we could probably climb on the roof of our vessel. And then if you had a good skipper that could bring you alongside, while that vessel was still in motion, maybe at, you know, 6 knots, 8 knots, 10 knots, something like that, you could get onto the pilot ladder and then you could board that vessel. And then we'd be going up to speak to the captain of the ship, and we'd be wanting to see crew lists and maybe look at their passports, because obviously you've got people coming in from all over the world as crew. Generally, none of them will be coming ashore, or if they did, it was very short term. Some wouldn't come ashore at all. They would just stay on that boat, as they weren't allowed to leave the vessel. But again, you know, you have to have an idea of who is coming. Bear in mind, you know, this is the capital of the UK, London, so we need to know who and what is coming up the river, you know. And on some occasions we had some very good operations where they're a bit sneakier, and this is where we talked about plain boats, etc. There was information, for example, that commercial vessels were coming up and dropping off packages of drugs overboard that were marked with buoys or small GPS markers, and they would agree with somebody on the shore, you know, that they would drop the drugs off at a certain point, and then somebody from the shore obviously would go and collect those drugs or whatever it was. And it could have been anything, of course. Could have been weapons or, you know, explosives or anything. So it was something we kept an eye on, and we had a couple of really great operations there where one night one of our crews was tucked away in some marshes waiting for this to happen, and sure enough, the gear got dropped overboard on the ship, and then they weren't quite sure where the person was going to come from to collect it, but it turns out there was a guy in the marshes as well, but, you know, very difficult to see, who was tucked away. Bear in mind, we're talking about sort of 3 o'clock in the morning, so it's pitch black. And he was in a wetsuit, you know, he had like a paddleboard or a surfboard, and, you know, a wetsuit on and stuff. And he basically was intending to paddle out and collect the gear. So that was quite a nice job to get hold of him. And I'm sure that sort of stuff goes on fairly regularly. So you had that side of it. We'd also use specialist ladders as well ourselves to get on board commercial ships, the big commercial ships. If they hadn't lowered a pilot ladder, or if you wanted to get on without them knowing that you were coming, you know, so you wouldn't call up on the radio and ask them, then we would use specialist ladders that I think originally are kind of used by Royal Marines and that. And I'm certainly not putting us in the same, you know, in the same area as those guys. They're the professionals, you know, the military that are used to boarding vessels rapidly. We did do some training with those sorts of guys sometimes, but certainly it was something very much they taught to us, you know, and that we then practice, you know, getting on board ships sort of I wouldn't say opposed to getting on, but certainly it wasn't something that you'd called up when you weren't invited on as such. So we were definitely getting on, without being invited as such. So that was one side of things. That was always good. New Year's Eve, now that's always a good night if you're working on the boats. A very busy night. Like most capitals, New Year's Eve's and the sort of fireworks display is an absolute massive event. Well, London is no different. And I think on the embankment up by sort of Westminster, they can expect 100,000 people to be sort of shoreside. And you can always expect some of them to go in the water at some point. Quite often, when Big Ben chimes at midnight, somebody feels like it's a good idea that, they're drunk and they're going to jump off a bridge and celebrate New Year's Eve. I'm not quite sure why you would think that, because, this is fast-flowing dark water at night, you're drunk, and, it's probably, kind of 2 or 3 degrees temperature, air temperature, it's obviously the winter, it's freezing, so you really are at risk. So there would be boats, lots and lots of police vessels up overnight, working that event. And basically, if you're on the unit, you were almost certainly working that night. Hardly anyone had the night off, to have the whole team out with a lot of police boats, because you could have up to 20 or 30, maybe more party boats. And each one of those party boats, which is effectively a floating disco, might have 200 or 300 people on board. There was obviously bigger and smaller ones, but that's kind of a rough idea of the size of boats. So you imagine now 20 of those coming up with 200 on each. Not only have you got the potential issue that you may have fights on board, assaults, we did have shootings and stabbings on board the boat sometimes, but you also had the navigational issue that all those big vessels packed in a very tight space, because the river is not that wide up by Westminster, and of course they're all vying for the best position to show their clients, the sort of best view of the fireworks when they happen at midnight. So it was quite a carefully orchestrated night, but it wasn't unusual to have the odd boat, crashing into each other and what have you, as well as the criminal element. As I say, we quite often, if there was large fights on board, we would have to go on board as well, although our preferred choice was to get that party boat across to one of the pontoons alongside the river, alongside the embankment, because you can imagine if there's 50 people fighting on board a boat, you don't really want to put 2 Marine unit crew on board to try and break it up. It's not very fair. So really you wanted that boat to come alongside, and then you'd have various riot teams on standby that were able to board the boat from the shore. And certainly on a couple of occasions, on one occasion particularly, when I approached a boat that we'd been told that a certain London gang had taken over the night, had chartered it for the night, and there was a big fight on board apparently, and there was talk of guns being shown and pulled and what have you. We approached the boat, several Marine unit boats approached it, and as we approached it from one side, there was kind of a series of splashes in the water from the other side, as almost certainly various handguns and weapons were being sort of thrown in the water from the other side. So it just shows you, it was there. It could be a problem for sure. So yeah, New Year's Eve was brilliant, and certainly at midnight, there's firework barges that are dragged into the river, and they sit underneath the London Eye, and no vessels are allowed to move either side of that. The only vessels that are allowed in there is maybe a couple of tugboats. If there was a problem, if one of those barges came free, you needed to be able to grab it, particularly as once they'd started firing off those fireworks, of which there are thousands, they're just going to keep going. It's not like you can stop it in the middle of the display. So you can imagine if one of those came free and drifted down the river, you could have the fireworks heading into all the buildings and stuff. So a couple of tugboats were allowed in, but other than police, no other vessels were allowed in, or certainly to move during that time. So we would be able to get a really good view, and we would bring our boats in and tuck them right out the way so that people couldn't see them from on shore, but we were basically bang in front of, one of the best firework displays in the world, quite frankly. So I'm a little bit biased possibly, but so that could be a really, really good night to work. I mean, it could be a long night, and in fact that led me to probably one of my more unusual arrests. It had gone midnight, so it's probably like 1 o'clock in the morning or something. We had a call to a fight on a party boat, but the party boat was alongside. Now I was in a wetsuit, because I'd been designated as one of the people that may be having to go into the water to get that, late night reveller we talked about earlier, jumping off the bridge thinking it's a good idea. So I was in a wetsuit. and there was me and some colleagues went along and went on board the boat. And there was a guy there, basically, who was mouthing off. He'd assaulted someone, and then when we tried to speak to him, he told us where to go, not in the nicest way. So he was always getting arrested. So I arrested him, I think, for public order and assault, as it was. And then, of course, now you're in the scenario that at 1 o'clock in the morning, central London, you're trying to find a space. You're trying to find a cell for him. Now, obviously, there is hundreds of cells available within London at any one time. And they generally put on extra staff so they can have even more cells on New Year's Eve, because clearly it's a very, very busy night. But you still had to call up and find out, where there was a space for you, and then get designated a cell space before you headed there. You couldn't just, because probably the closest police station to where I was at the time was Charing Cross police station, which is, has a lot of cells now. I think it's like 70 cells or something. So it's a really big nick with a lot of cells. But at 1 o'clock, in the morning on New Year's Eve, they were, full to capacity. So they were having to find, and they kept sort of calling up for me. The radio the radio controller was calling up, finding different people to look for different spaces, and gradually getting further and further out from London as they were trying to find me a space. Eventually they called up all chirpy and said, yeah, we found your space. We got you one at Enfield. Now, Enfield is North London and about as far from the river as you could get. So sure enough, they called up. Bearing in mind, I'm in a wetsuit at this point, probably one of about 2 cops in the entire Met to be wearing a wetsuit on New Year's Eve. And because they didn't want to take all the resources, or like the 2 of us away from the wetsuits, they kept my pal back, who was in his wetsuit. So I ended up going by myself with this prisoner. I was picked up by a prison van. He was put in the back. And by now this had taken, an hour or 2 to sort it out. So it was probably like 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning, something like that. By the time I put my prisoner in the back of the van, in my wetsuit, got into the back of the police van, and then was then driven up to Enfield. Well, one of the only routes you can take is across Trafalgar Square, because a lot of the roads are closed, and it's like the busiest night. It's like a war zone going through Trafalgar Square. And I'd already had some very strange looks from the cops that picked me up, and they were kind of looking me up and down, going, "What are you wearing?" I was like, "It's a wetsuit. Not seen a wetsuit before?" They're like, "Yeah, but you are a cop, aren't you? You've arrested this guy." They just couldn't get their head around it. And I knew it wasn't going to get any better where I was going. So sure enough, I had this half an hour drive. It was probably longer, maybe 45-minute drive across London, sort of fighting our way through traffic and various incidents that we were trying to avoid because we just didn't have the capacity with our guy in the back already. And they dropped me off to Enfield, and I'll never forget the custody sergeant's face as I took my prisoner by the arm and walked him into the custody in my wetsuit. I was wearing like a police baseball cap and a wetsuit, basically, that was it. And sort of wetsuit boots as well, which are sort of very soft, flimsy, rubbery things. And the custody sergeant, I walked in and he literally just stopped. It was a moment that the whole place went quiet, and he just looked me up and down, and he was like, "What the hell have you come as?" He just couldn't get his head around it. I was like, "Oh, hi, Sarge. Yeah, I've got one for you," And he was like, "But where have you come from?" And I said, "Oh, he's been nicked off a party boat, on the river." And they were like, "The river?" What? I just, he just couldn't process what was going on. I said, "Look, I'm on the Marine unit. I'm in a wetsuit for the night. This bad man has done bad things on a boat. I've arrested him and brought him to you on a plate." And he was just shaking his head, just going, "I've never, ever seen anything like it." He said, "I've seen a few things in the job, but never cops turning up in wetsuits with prisoners," So that was, I certainly gave them a laugh anyway, and me as well, because I didn't get back until about, I think it was about 9 or 10 o'clock the next day. By the time I'd written up the paperwork and then convinced someone from Early Turn to drive all the way out from our base to pick me up from Enfield to come back in. It was a pretty long night for sure. But there we go. So that was quite amusing. Another training we did that was also very interesting. It was something that, it's a relatively recent thing. They've had them for a while. We called them kind of death dogs, but they're also called cadaver dogs, as in dead body cadaver. And they're trained specifically to find death. Now, you might think that that's a really good idea and handy. And to be honest with you, it is, with limitations. And again, we use them a lot later, and I'll talk about them in later episodes particularly. But when the idea first came on, and we're talking now back in 2009, something like that. I mean, it may have started before then, but certainly that's when I first became involved in it. So it's a while ago now. Basically, they were normal sort of police search dogs. And as it stands, they can train police search dogs pretty much to find anything, but you just have to use them on that specific smell. So we have dogs that are trained to find guns. We have cash dogs that find money. They particularly work, say, in airports, for example, because there's limits on how much cash you can actually bring in and out of different countries, including ours. I think at one point it was like £10,000 or something is the maximum cash you can move. It may be a different figure now, and different countries are different, but sort of OCG, organised crime gangs, would try and move, £50,000, £100,000 in cash in a bag. So you'd have these cash dogs wandering around the airports trying to locate that. So we'd have them trained for firearms, for drugs, for cash. Pretty much, anything you can think of, you can train them on. Obviously not in the police, but certainly I'm aware that some dogs are trained in cancer detection, and they're able to sniff, a series of people and then indicate, and that's probably by sitting down or pointing or whatever, barking. If they find someone that they believe has cancer, I mean, that's just incredible. But it's all about training the dog on that specific smell. So somebody somewhere came up with the idea that we should train dogs specifically for death. And that would be really useful in a sort of marine type role. So that's exactly what happened. And the way we trained them was we would take them out. You remember I talked about the van calls we had, and we had our little sort of 3 metre pump up inflatable boat. We would have a normal search dog, and he'd been trained on this sort of death smell. And the way they did that was they got pork, which is, very close to human flesh. And then they would go to the hospitals where they had an agreement that the hospitals would give them waste products, which was blood, basically, for whatever reason, whether it had gone off or not been used or been contaminated or whatever. But this pork would be soaked in the human blood, and then we would train them. And now initially we'd start off in, barely moving streams that were like an inch or two deep, and they would put the pork and the blood, within a small plastic pot with, a couple of holes drilled in it just to let some of the scent out. And place them in the river, and then train the dog to go and find it. And we got progressively deeper and progressively harder. So you'd have faster flowing water, then it'd be deeper, then it'd be bigger bodies of water. And eventually, when they sort of peaked, what we moved on to was you could take one of those death dogs into a London dock, which might be 10 metres deep, so sort of 33 feet deep, something like that. And you could have either placed it yourself with, a piece of string, or you could have got one of the police divers to have put it on the bottom for you. And you could then place the dog on the front of the inflatable and basically carry out a search pattern where you'd be going up and down in a sort of work in a search pattern with the dog sort of standing on the bow of the boat with his nose virtually in the water. And you're waiting for him to indicate. Now, all dogs indicate in different ways. Some would paw the water, some would bark. We had one that would always throw himself in, which wasn't that useful, but it seemed to work for him. So there was different ways that they could indicate, certainly. And that they got really good at it, actually. And we used them later on. As I say, I'll go into a bit more detail when I talk about some of the examples we use them on. But they certainly had their place, but there was definitely limitations. So we'll talk about those. Another ability that you had was for a mud search. Now, they're always good fun to train for, but obviously there was a serious sort of undertones to it. And what that was, a lot of the Thames, when you're at low tide, down by the water could be very deep, thick, sort of glutinous mud, the sort of mud that, you stand in and you instantly sink up to your knees or maybe beyond, and there's no getting out of it. You're not just going to, oh, that's easy, I'll just, pull my leg out and then carry on walking. You're absolutely stuck, and the more you wriggle, the deeper you go, to the point that you are completely and utterly stuck. You cannot move. And of course, the issue with that is that if you've gone in at low tide, for example, you've got that half an hour, maybe an hour, 45 minutes of low tide and of slack water and nothing's happening. Then, of course, the tide turns and starts coming in. Now, bearing in mind, there could be, 7 metres of water, of depth of water to come in. Very quickly, you are going to be underwater. And obviously, to save people drowning, they would need to be rescued. So the lifeboat had the ability to, to save people during that, but we certainly trained as a marine unit as well. And it always, as I say, it was good fun as the training days, but you basically had to put a dry suit on. And then we had specialist folding mats that were kind of, I think each mat was maybe 10 metres long, something like that, and perhaps about 2 metres wide, but we had 3 of them in each van. So you had the ability to sort of have 30 metres of rolled out inflatable mat, quite a thick inflatable mat that you filled up with compressed air from a dive cylinder, and that would then keep it nice and flat and actually enable you to be able to crawl on your belly effectively to the person and save them, you know. So yeah, that was a really good option as well. Certainly, and what would happen is, because there was 3 mats, you could crawl out on 2 of them and then take the mat you'd just been on and move it to the front, you know, front mat effectively, so you could sort of concertina your way out to the where the person was in trouble, and then basically save them, do a mud rescue, you know, and get them on the mat and carry them away. I will just mention where I'm sitting, it's just started raining heavily, so there's a little bit of background noise, that's what it is. I'll keep going for now unless it gets stupid heavy. So that was, yeah, that was quite interesting. The mud search side of it was very good. And it was around about this time, I'd been on the Marine unit probably a year or so now, and we had a new sergeant join us. Our old sergeant had retired, and a really good guy, and this new one coming on was equally, had a really good reputation and was very well thought of. New to the Marine unit though. So he joined us for the day, and on his first day, you know, he's full of enthusiasm, as we all are, and yeah, really nice guy, easy to get on with, so that was good. And of course he was asking lots of questions, you know, so how does this work, and what do we do in this scenario, and how many rescues do you do, and how many jumpers do you get, and all that sort of thing. And I said to him, well, it's very, very random, you know, it can be no work for a week, and then you get 3 jumpers in a day, you know, so we'll just have to see how it goes. And of course he was, you know, much as you don't wish death and destruction, you kind of also want something to happen. You know, most people want to actually get stuck into something. And sure enough, we were lucky is possibly the wrong word, but to get a call to somebody who was threatening suicide down, well, way down the river, in fact. So we went hammering down there on blue lights, and we wanted to see, you know, if we could get there and save this person. It was a female, apparently. She was drunk and she was on one of the pontoons threatening to jump, so we'd gone down. Now when we got down there, she was standing on the edge of one of the pontoons, and she had half a bottle of vodka in her hand. She was very drunk, swaying about, and she was standing on the uptide side of the pontoon. Now the pontoon was quite long, maybe 50 metres long and sort of 10 metres wide, so a big pontoon that's moored in the river where the sort of passenger boats would come into. And what happened was, she went on the end, and you know, this new sergeant was saying, oh, do you think she'll jump? You know, the tide was racing towards her on the end she was standing. That's really important. And I was saying, well, you know, probably not, because cry for help, you know, somebody's phoned up, and I think she'd have done it by now if she was going to. And we'd only been there for a minute or two, and we just started talking to, saying, hi, are you all right? Can we help at all? What's the matter? You know, talk to us. And just started our normal sort of patter, when she just stepped off the end of the pontoon, and basically, because the tide was pushing against her, she immediately got, this rain is getting a bit of a pain, as you can hear, she got immediately swept under the pontoon and disappeared from sight. So we were all a bit shocked at first as she'd done it, and then secondly, she was never going to be able to hold up this ton of weight of water against her, so she was immediately swept under. But this thing was 10 metres wide, you know, and kind of, you know, 50 metres long, so it wasn't like we could start searching underneath it. So the new sergeant grabs a boat hook, which was only about 8 feet, 10 feet long, with a big sort of metallic hook on the end of it. And as we drift down alongside, roughly where she might have been, he starts digging around underneath with this boat hook, you know. And I said, I don't think that's going to work, you know. And he said, well, kind of got to do something. I said, well, okay, you know, fill your boots, but I just didn't think it was going to be of any value at all. Anyway, he carried on doing it, and within about 5 minutes, he says, I think I've got something. And I just assumed he'd snagged a chain. And he pulled it back out, and sure enough, he'd only gone and hooked her. And when I say hooked her, he literally hooked her. The big metal hook on the end had gone right through her shoulder and come out sort of round the back by her neck, which was pretty brutal to see. He'd effectively gaffed her like a fish. But we dragged her on board, and she was unconscious at this point. She'd inhaled a lot of water, as you'd expect. And we basically started cutting her clothes off her, put the defib pads on her, and tried to, you know, start bringing her back to life. And we were just about to go into full-on CPR mode when she coughed a couple of times, spluttered water everywhere, and then sort of came back to life, which is pretty rare. Although she hadn't been under long, but it was even rarer that he'd managed to actually hook her, which was incredible. So once she'd gained consciousness and come round, she immediately started fighting with us, throwing punches at us. I mean, this, it's a great world where you save someone's life and the first thing they think to do is attack you. But she'd taken drugs or drink or both, so she didn't know what was going on. So we basically had to sort of wrestle and fight with her until we could get her alongside shore to get her picked up by an ambulance. But it turned out, into a right old kerfuffle, effectively, and quite a big incident. And of course, at the end of the day, we were then heading back to the base, and the sergeant was like, "Wow, is it like this every day?" And I was like, "No, it's not necessarily, but you were just lucky or unlucky, as the case may be." But I think he thoroughly enjoyed his day, and certainly thought he'd made the right choice in his career in terms of his new job. So that was quite an interesting one. Right, I'm hoping you've heard me over the last bit of rain. I'm going to call it to a stop because we're about half an hour anyway. Sorry for the rain. I didn't want to stop because we were so far in, but hopefully you still heard me over it. Okay, we'll be on to more stuff next week. Thanks for listening. Hope you found it enjoyable and not too disturbed. We'll speak again soon. Cheers. Bye.